problems of youth violence here in Chicago. She's covered the Trayvon Martin case as well. She's covered tornado outbreaks all over the Midwest and has even tried to explain that mess down in Springfield that we think of as the Illinois government. Ladies and gentlemen, your host for this afternoon's plenary is NPR's Cheryl Corley.
I'll have my panelists come on up to the stage as well. I'll be introducing them as we go along here. But good afternoon. A pleasure to be here with you today at the NLGJA convention. Get settled. You know, just last year, an organization called the Foundation Center released a report that took a look at media-related grant making by U.S. foundations over a 2-year period from 2009 to 2011. And all three of the foundations represented here today, Knight, McCormick, and Ford, played a role in that report. The Knight Foundation helped fund it, while the Ford Foundation and McCormick's Mark Hallet, who is here on the panel, served as advisors. You know, I think all of us know that we've seen so much upheaval in the journalism world and change that it's probably no surprise that the report found that there has been an increasing flow of foundation dollars for media, and that money has allowed various types of initiatives to either continue or to actually begin. Money used to support journalism, news and information, and other areas like applications for news and media tools or telecommunications infrastructure. So while revenue for many media outlets, especially traditional ones, has been dropping faster than a boulder off a cliff, the rate of giving for media by foundations was on the rise, nearly 4 times higher than it was for any other type of domestic giving, especially from 2009 to 2011, nearly $2 billion from foundations from about 1,000 foundations. So with that backdrop, I'm going to introduce our panelists. In the center is Mark Hallet. He's a senior program officer in the journalism program of the McCormick Foundation. He'll celebrate his 20th year with McCormick next year. And he holds a special interest in youth journalism, community news, free press issues, photojournalism, and documentary. Prior to joining the foundation, Mark was at Safety and Health magazine, where he launched an international edition and edited, assigned, and wrote stories on workplace safety and environmental issues. He's an avid photographer and has lived in Mexico, Norway, and Spain. And we had a deep discussion about the weird configuration of Norway. Barbara Raab is the program officer for media and justice grants at the Ford Foundation in New York City. Her work focuses on the support of a free and responsible press in the United States and emphasizes social justice issues, diversity of voices, standards and ethics, and press freedoms. And before joining the Ford Foundation earlier this year, Barbara was a senior member of the editorial leadership team at NBC News, as senior news writer for NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams, and in 2013 as senior producer for In Plain Sight. That show, NBC News' multi-platform reporting effort on poverty in America, won a George Foster Peabody Award. John Bracken oversees the Knight News Challenge and Knight's Prototype Fund and the Foundation's other journalism and technology investments. He worked previously at the Ford Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation. He has over 12 years of experience as a philanthropic investor in digital media policy, and innovation. He joined the Knight Foundation 4 years ago and serves on the board of the Illinois Humanities Council and has been a fellow of Leadership Greater Chicago. He was named last year one of Crane Chicago Business Magazine's Tech 50. So if you have any technical questions, that's the guy. I think. He says no. I also want to say that You know, I'm going to ask questions, but I also invite you, as we get a little further along in the program, if you have questions, we'll certainly invite you to do so, and we'll be able to take those on. But what I want to start off doing is have each of you, and John, we'll start off with you, just talk about your experience in funding journalism projects and really what made this type of job attractive to you.
Sure. Good afternoon. Actually, I'm going to start with numbers and math, since that's a really exciting way to start a panel on that. When Cheryl referred to the $2 billion in investments that foundations are making in media, and I just looked up a study that the National Association of Newspapers did, and between 2000 and 2010, over $45 billion were lost in revenue in newspapers alone. So again, I'm not a math major in college, but 45 is a lot bigger than 2. Knight Foundation is the largest funder of journalism and journalism education projects in the U.S., and our entire corpus is somewhere around $2 billion. So that math sort of motivates where we've ended up, which is less trying to plug holes in the crisis in the industry and trying to stopgap holes in content. And rather, really, we've put a lot of our chips in trying to figure out what are the new structures, what are the new behaviors, what are the new tools and mechanisms by which citizens are going to be informed about what's going on around them. So anyway, I'll touch more on that going forward. But the $2 billion caught my ear, and I wanted to measure that against actual revenue.
Go ahead. Okay.
Yeah. Mark.
So what John said is really interesting, and I think puts into perspective, in terms of size, where philanthropy fits next to what's really nationally a pretty big industry. I'm going to give you a really quick narrative on how the journalism program at McCormick has changed in the time that I've been there. And the reason I do that is because I think to some degree it reflects the way the news business has changed. So back in, I guess, 1995, May 8th at 8:30 when I started, we were supporters of news leadership programs. There was this thing called the internet, which was coming along really quickly. It was sort of a tsunami offshore, and everyone knew that it was A, going to open up amazing reporting possibilities, sharing information, audience engagement, etc., and that B, it probably also meant that someone else was going to eat your lunch. And so we were supporting work with news leadership initiatives across the country. Jean Gaddy Wilson is probably a name that doesn't mean a whole lot to a lot of people here, but others. Also thinking about diversity in news organizations, particularly with an eye toward the top, toward the executive suites, with the thought that if you could help diversify the executive suites in news organizations, that those people would bring along a sensibility that would help shape coverage, staffing, etc. We also actually invested about a quarter of our budget from 95 through 2005, 2006 in press freedom initiatives throughout Latin America, both hemispherically and country by country, to try to help shape a better legal framework for journalism. And that actually helped contribute to a lot of opening up of open government, transparency, anti-criminal defamation work, etc. So fast forward to today. And with all that's happened in the news industry, we realized that foundation dollars are really, really small compared to all of the sort of problems and challenges that are out there. Fast forwarding to today, and we're about the same size program. Journalistically at McCormick, we're basically a $5.5 million a year grant-making program. And so we're investing in youth. And after struggling for years to try to help mainstream news organizations become more diverse, we decided to turn more to groups that are organically and naturally and comprehensively diverse. And a lot of that is what we see in youth media organizations in cities like Chicago, San Francisco, New York, and others have really rich communities of youth media. We're also doing a lot that's around community media. And it was out of some of the research that we've seen that community media resonates and has, well, in addition to this sort of more innate diversity, strong credibility and street cred with readers, viewers, and listeners at the local level. And so we've tried to do a lot that helps to support the sector of community media, first nationally in a number of markets and now increasingly in Chicago. The third area that we're focusing more on today is the audience. And so it's with an eye toward audience engagement was always sort of a peripheral activity in a lot of the work that we were supporting and a lot of the work that we saw. And we decided, let's not put the audience off as a peripheral initiative. Let's make that a front center, front burner initiative for a time and really look at where audiences are, the changing definitions of news, the changing ways of engaging with news, the platforms that are resonating with people, how people are sharing news, etc., is a really quickly evolving and changing area. And so we call it Why News Matters or news literacy, but at the heart of it, it's trying to better understand news consumers and where they are and what's resonating. And that, hopefully will help people in low-income communities with people's life skills, etc. But it's also a way to tap into information that hopefully will help journalists and news organizations of all kinds better understand audiences and where they're headed and be prepared for changes.
Hi, thanks for having me. One thing Cheryl didn't say in my bio, but I really feel duty bound to point it out, is that many years ago, I don't even know if it was 24 or 25, but the Chicago chapter of NLGJA started in my living room on East Ohio Street when I was here working for Channel 2. So I just want to say, for me, this is actually very exciting and very interesting closing of the circle to be here talking to you all today. So I have so much to say here. I don't want to cause the whole panel, but one of the things I think you're hearing from John and Mark, and it's true where I am also at the Ford Foundation in New York, is that for those people who are not familiar with the way foundations work, especially when it comes to journalism, you might have expected to hear the kinds of stories that we fund. And what you just heard is my colleagues here saying, well, we're not doing so much the content, the stories, we're looking at other aspects of journalism, and that's kind of true where I am as well. I should probably say, just for context, the Ford Foundation sees itself as because it is a global foundation. We have offices in the United States and a handful of other regions around the globe. And the overall mission of the Ford Foundation is social change, social justice. So everything that we do is kind of in service to that. So some years ago, before I got there, and I've been there for like 6 months and 2 days, but before I got there, the Ford Foundation, during what sort of as journalism started to just fall in on itself, was doing a lot of funding of the journalism, of the content, of the reporting, the work that maybe a lot of you in this room do. And in fact, as you heard in the introduction, in 2013, when I was still at NBC, I worked on a project covering poverty that was funded by the Ford Foundation. So that was a content grant. And when I got to the Ford Foundation in this job 6 months ago, I actually thought that I would be funding content. But it turns out that things had shifted to other aspects of the field. And I use that word deliberately. Really what we are mostly funding is what I would call, building back or supporting the field of journalism. So I still do some funding of just reporting itself. That's about 20% of what I do in the media area. About 60% of what I do in the media area is capacity building for journalism organizations that tend to do the kind of reporting that the Ford Foundation cares about. So it would be mostly nonprofit journalism organizations that do investigative work, hold the powerful to account, perhaps report on things like poverty, immigration, social justice issues. But I'm not funding the reporting in that situation. I'm supporting the organization with the notion that if you can help the organization be healthy, then the reporting is what the organization does. But the proposals that I see are increasingly not, here's the reporting project we want to do. They're much more, here's what we need. We need a social media editor. We need to improve our digital tools. We need to hire certain people into certain positions to deliver news in new ways. So that's a lot of what I do. And then the other 20% of what I do is kind of this mixture of the buzz phrase we use, and philanthropy has a ton of buzz phrases, is this is going to cover everything. Robust media ecosystem. Everyone got that? Robust media ecosystem. It's everything. And what that means is everything from diversity in the profession to supporting organizations that work on press freedoms worldwide. And this week is of particular relevance to the Ford Foundation because we support the committee to protect journalists, for example. And as you know, this week they've been very much in the news because of what's happened in Syria. So that's what I do. But I would say the vast bulk of what I do is organizational support, not so much reporting. I have a little list just to give you an example of some of the places. This might be less theoretical, but here are just some examples of the places that my portfolio supports. Some of the investigative work we support the Center for Investigative Reporting, the Center for Public Integrity, ProPublica. Other big grants for us are the Marketplace Wealth and Poverty Desk, Frontline, Global Post, where the reporter had actually been working in this area. We also support 5 beats at the LA Times to cover things like race and immigration. Texas Tribune, StoryCorps, and then we have much smaller grants out to places like, including the Chicago Reporter here in Chicago, an organization called Kalanick Broadcasting, which covers Native American issues. And some of our diversity grants are a grant we have. It's a joint grant between NLGJA and the Asian journalists. We fund Unity for a program they do to help news entrepreneurs of color work on their projects. We do some news literacy funding actually, the News Literacy Project and something called Pundit Fact. So those are just some examples of the organizations we support, but in most of the cases that I just told you, we're not supporting this, I don't even know always what reporting we are going to see them do. It's the organizations that we are there to support.
You raised some interesting points, and I wanted to touch on 2 things. Barbara, you talked about funding organizations and about making sure that organizations are, the whole sustainability aspect of it all. And I was wondering, Mark and John, if your foundations, if that's the way you see foundations going as well, if your organizations are looking at that too, or is it more on programs?
I'll jump in quickly. I would agree.
Refer to my elders.
I would second Barbara's comment that, so a little bit more on the context of what John raised earlier, the 1.6 billion or whatever of funding 2009 to 2011 in journalism includes a lot. It includes filmmaking, it includes J schools, it includes support to the museum in DC. It's a lot, and if the panel had 20 people here, we'd probably hear really, really different angles on why different people are supporting media making. And so I think the 3 of us are at 3 of 5 or 6 or 7 foundations nationally where journalism itself is sort of the industry, the groups, etc., are really of core concern. And if you go out to a broader circle, you'd hear more from funders of the environment who then support environmental fellowships, etc. So to get to your question, I think most of our support is for field building, and that gets to John's comment that our dollars are really small compared to the industry size, etc. You want to see leverage. We care about a lot of organizations. We care about their storytelling and their reporting. So we want to push them to be stronger organizations. We want to give them support, but with the hope that they'll be creative about going out and building up membership or individual donors or using events to raise money, etc. Doing all these things and experimenting with more to try to be able to do better storytelling. And a lot of what I see, to be honest with you, is you see a lot of reporters who've now moved into the nonprofit sector and are taking on new hats. And it's a difficult transition for people from news to go out and learn to deal with a board, or to deal with a funder, or to try to make a pitch for support, etc. Those are skill sets that come really, really naturally for some people, but are difficult for others. So short answer is that building sustainability, and sustainability is one of these industry words that you just hear over and over. And everyone asks for your sustainability plan, which is sort of a chart that goes like that. It goes upward toward the right. And I think we're in a real transition and sort of hybrid moment where we have more questions than answers about what sustainability is going to end up looking like. But at McCormick, the actual support for specific stories or a specific series of stories is pretty low. It's more about field building, helping to build up the skill sets of groups that we care about, etc.
Okay.
So for most of our portfolio, I won't ask you about sustainability. We don't use the word sustainability for the big chunk of our portfolio. One of the three areas in which we're focused is on uplifting entrepreneurship and innovation. And one of the tools we have for that is what we call the Prototype Fund, prototypefund.org. And basically we designed it out of a realization, it took us years to realize this, that in many cases it's actually easier, especially when it comes to digital tools and digital approaches, just to test an idea rather than to think about it. Right? It's often cheaper for us just to fund you with your idea rather than take you through our 6 to 12 month foundation process and ask you for a report or a sustainability plan. And so the Prototype Fund, which we've been running for about 2 years now, funds a $35,000 grant and a 2 to 3 day human-centered design training session, where the emphasis we have with that program is we don't care whether the project you're proposing works or not. In fact, the bar we have internally is that 80% of the projects we fund through that fund will not work, will not survive. But the social benefit we're trying to get is we're trying to learn something from each of those projects. So again, rather than have these sit as proposals that sit in our inboxes that we go through every 6 months, the Prototype Fund is open. We go through the box quarterly. We create a cohort-like experience where we bring people into a space, give them the human-centered design training session, which basically means helping them identify what their assumptions are about their idea, and before they actually build it, begin to test those assumptions and engage with real people who might be using their tools. So that's my big sales pitch. I'll mention it 2 or 3 times today. It's prototypefund.org. But that's one way we've short-circuited the sustainability model, knowing that there's so much we don't know about this new world and this new environment, the emerging behaviors that we're seeing, that one of the ways we can contribute to that knowledge base is to test lots of little ideas and then share them with the field.
I just want to jump in here and say 2 things about this. One is, for those of you in the room that are publishers in particular on the business side of what you do, or editors on the business, who also work on this, if you think about field building, what's the field that we potentially have in this room? The field potentially is LGBT media as a field, right, as a subfield of the journalism field. And one thing that you all might want to think about talking to each other about is, if you're going to approach a big national funder like any of us or some of the others that are out there, probably the newspaper or media organization that you work at is probably a local or regional one and not kind of in the sweet spot of what we do. But maybe there is a way to come up with we love collaboration, right? So maybe there's a way to come up with an idea, and I don't mean, like this afternoon, these things take a while to cultivate, but is there a collaborative idea that really could feasibly be seen as an LGBT media field building idea that would mean you don't have to work together on something that not only benefits your individual organizations, but elevates the field in a way that the sum is greater than the parts. So that's just something to think about if you're talking about big national funders. And then on the sustainability piece, I don't typically use that word when people come to talk to me about support, but always in my mind is the fact that, and I do think this has changed over time, even though I wasn't there for this change, but I see it. The Ford Foundation doesn't want to be the difference between life and death for your organization. We want to help support you, maybe give you some runway space to get to the point where you can take off, and it doesn't even mean take off without us, but we don't want to be 100% of your budget. We don't even really want to be 50% of your budget. And so we do talk to you increasingly about, sort of what is your overall, just your model. If we disappeared, if we didn't support you, or if we supported you, but at the end of the grant, we didn't renew your grant, where would you be? Because it is something that you need to think about. And I think that has changed. I think there was a time when foundations, certainly Ford Foundation's journalism area, was in some cases fine to be 100% of your support because we wanted the work to get done. And the dollars are so scarce. My budget is going to sound like a lot to you when I say it. My annual budget this year was $10.5 million, right? So you think, wow, I could do a ton of grant making. Well, I do a fair amount, but I've never actually added this up, but I probably support, 1 in 20 requests for support. So the question is always, am I choosing to support something that has a pretty good shot of being there, even if the Ford Foundation were not? And so I just tell you all this because I just came out of 30 years in a newsroom where I didn't think about this stuff at all. And if you had asked me a year ago what kind of pitch would I make to a foundation of any size, I would go in all excited about the journalism. That's what brings journalists. That's what makes journalists excited. Nobody says I have such exciting ideas about my sustainability. They don't say that. They say, I'm so excited I want to report on, LGBT X, Y, or Z in Chicago. Let me tell you about this thing I want to do, and there are all these great stories, and that's what drives journalists. And that's fine, but you just got to know that what drives funders is, okay, but let's talk about what else is there for your organization. And we just made a grant to a large journalism organization where they came in talking to us about this fabulous editorial project they wanted to do, and by the time we were done, the grant we made was for strategic planning, capacity building, stuff that could put you to sleep. But if we didn't do that, this organization is at a crossroads for its own survival, and so we want to help them get healthier so they can do all that stuff that is the initial thing that excites them. So it's just something you should know about kind of when you talk to the people who do what we do. We're listening for that stuff as much as we're listening for what turns you on.
You mentioned that one of the ways that LGBT groups might be able to get funding is to do this kind of partnership thing. And I was wondering, just first off, if we talk about your organizations already, have LGBT organizations received funding, or are there other ways your foundations support this LGBT work?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, if the question is how much has McCormick given to LGBT initiatives specifically over time, the answer is not enough. I mean, there's no question. Although we are sponsors of today's luncheon, so I hope you appreciate that.
The dessert was
there. Was the dessert?
It's a good start.
Yeah, it's a good start. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I would say that historically the work that we've supported for many years around diversity, cut a wide swath. I mean, a lot of the goal of the support for diversity. There was a report that came out 2003 by Senators Keith Woods, who's a person that some of you may know, and it was about checking it at the door, for example. And it was this cohort of that at that time, I think about 70 news execs of color, and they did an anonymous survey of news leaders of color at that time. And one of the really, really big issues was how much of your own personality you have to check at the door when you arrive at your workplace. And to me, that's a universal. and that sparked conversations about this notion of what does an organization, a workplace, a news organization look like that actually celebrates its own internal diversity rather than clamping down on it. The other area where I think McCormick's support has been important to LGBT communities is, frankly, our work with youth media here in Chicago. And so part of the reason for supporting Free Spirit Media, Beyond Media, street level youth media, etc., Radio Arte at the Mexican Fine Arts Museum, and about 6 or 7, 8 other initiatives, is that they're not public high schools. They're safe spaces. They're places where young people can go and talk about a whole range of issues, including sexual identity, that they can't talk about. In fact, many high schools will the editors of the high school papers are specifically instructed to never talk about sexuality or sexual identity at all. And these places provide creative, journalistic, media making, youth development, what else? All of these ranges of skills and activities under one roof, and that's one of the reasons that we've been really proud to support the youth media sector here in Chicago. And as a side, I would mention to Barbara's point about if you work for smaller media and are looking for ways to perhaps gain traction and possibly gain support from larger funders, one of the things that I'm really proud that we've been able to support with the youth media sector in Chicago is they're coming together and forming a citywide network, so that before you had a dozen or so smaller youth media groups, today there's a network, and they actually collectively reach tens of thousands of young people, and instead of working siloed from one another, have this collective power, which is actually pretty exciting. So anyway, that's a little bit.
John?
So we don't have a specific focus other than the 3 areas in our journalism side and media innovation, other than the 3 areas which I don't think I fully listed in the chart. Besides entrepreneurship, our journalistic excellence, and a lot of the organizations that Barbara mentioned overlap with some of the areas we work in. In addition, journalism education is a part of that work. And the 3rd area that we've been trying to do more of this year is what we call open media systems. So it's the notion that in order that a big part of the rubric of where we're going to get our news and information going forward is the internet. And what do we need to do to preserve and strengthen the internet as an open platform for building new tools and new devices for getting news and information. So we just finished running what we call a Night News Challenge, actually in conjunction with Ford Foundation and Mozilla Foundation, where we invested $3.2 million in projects that were specifically designed to strengthen the open internet. One surprise we had was we invested in 19 projects, 10 of them as prototypes that I mentioned, 9 at scale. 3 of those 9 at scale came from libraries, including Chicago Public Library down the street. And partly through what we learned through the library conversations, we're launching the next Night News Challenge on libraries next month, because we see libraries as these key bridges between technology and innovation and the future of entrepreneurship and where communities are and how people get information about what's going on around them.
The Ford Foundation does fund a lot of LGBT stuff, and not necessarily in the media piece of things. We have a whole separate portfolio that does, LGBT rights is what it does. So that tends to be where the Ford Foundation will fund, big national organizations like Land Illegal and NGLTF and National Center for Lesbian Rights and the ACLU's, LGBT and AIDS projects, things like that, things that you've all heard of. But one interesting thing is that my colleague the media piece and the LGBT piece have done some collaborations. We also like to collaborate internally. It's not just something that we look for from you, but we collaborate a lot internally. So 2 grants that we did recently were collaborations between me and the program officer on the LGBT portfolio. And one was StoryCorps, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, has done a project, or has launched a project to collect the stories of LGBT people around the country. And so that was funded by the Ford Foundation as a collaborative grant between media, the media piece and the LGBT piece. And then we also jointly fund the sexuality reporter at ProPublica, who does a lot of work on LGBT stuff. So that's another collaboration. So that's one way that we work. And then I should have mentioned earlier, Ford Foundation has a separate portfolio for documentary films called Just Films. And they fund so many different documentaries. You may be familiar with one that came out in the last year or so called The New Black. That was partially supported by Just Films. And there's another one called Endgame, AIDS in Black America, that's supported by Just Films. So because we're a social justice foundation, there are different doors through which LGBT work is funded, and media is really only one of them, but we do a lot of collaborative work, and I suspect we're going to be doing more of that as we go forward. The Ford Foundation is currently in the midst of what we call a strategic review, and there may be some changes in the way we do our work. There's a new president, relatively new president. His name is Darren Walker, and he is a very out black gay man who grew up poor in Texas. And so when presidents change, strategies and the way we do our work changes. These guys have been around longer than me, and I'm seeing it for the first time. But I suspect we're going to be doing even more collaborative work, which I think is actually helpful when you think about the possibility of approaching the Ford Foundation for support.
Well, I have a few more questions. We only have a short amount of time, though, so I want to come out to the audience. Does anybody have a question out here? Yes, sir.
I have a question I'd like to direct to John, but the other people on the panel may have some input on it as well. What is your foundation's position on net neutrality, and will that impact diversity and access to the media, in your opinion?
So last week, actually, we sponsored a convening of the Aspen Institute, exploring some of these very questions. If you haven't seen it yet, one of the things we released was a report, and if you look up, Elise Hugh from NPR did some summaries of a report we did with Quid, examining the public discourse around net neutrality this year, and actually doing a content analysis of the comments and the commenters that submitted the 1.1 million comments to the FCC. So that all exists somewhere on the internet, which is to say that we're engaged. We're not, unlike Ford, we're not a social mission. We're not a social change funder, and we don't generally do policy. At the same time, we do recognize that in order for free expression and journalism to thrive in the near future, access to open platforms is essential. And so the News Challenge, those investment of $3.2 million in investments I mentioned, was part of that. I'll also say that in addition to the journalism and media innovation work, actually the largest program at Knight Foundation focuses on communities, specifically 8 communities where the Knight brothers own newspapers. And from a local perspective, so being grounded with colleagues in places like Macon and St. Paul and Charlotte, North Carolina, I think it makes us extra interested and concerned about the ability for citizens in cities and localities to be able to access the internet in a robust way. So we look at experiments. I'm going to Kansas City on Monday, and we're bringing together about 50 active grantees of ours to have a gathering in Kansas City, partly because the entrepreneurial and startup scene in Kansas City is so vibrant, partly because of the role that Google Fiber and robust internet for everyone in metropolitan Kansas City increasingly has, the impact that's had on that community. So all that's to say is it's an area that we're watching closely. We don't have a portfolio that funds policy organizations, but from a journalism point of view and from an organization where based in our DNA of making sure citizens have access to information to make their own decisions in a democracy, that's the motivation we have to engage on the topic. Did that answer you?
Sort of.
Sort of.
I know you've got various people that you interface with, businesses as well as institutions, and there are various points of view, and the outcome is something you really don't know what's going to happen if, in fact, net neutrality goes away. So I know you're kind of on new territory, shaky ground. That's what you've been saying all along up there.
Well, I'll give you a simple answer. The Ford Foundation does have a portfolio that is radically committed to net neutrality, and we fund policy organizations that work to keep it that way. End of story. So.
Okay, yes, sir.
I'm thinking about LGBT media that fall into two categories in my head. One is the newspapers and whatnot that have been around for a long time, and yet have been finding a shrinking ad base because of the economy and the internet and whatnot. I'm also thinking of a lot of new startup publications. A lot of them are online only, but some of them are on paper. But again, it's always a struggle because of shrinking ad dollars and the economy. My question is how, whether it's a new publication or a publication that's been around for a long time but is now struggling, how can any of your organizations help them?
So one of the things we've adapted to this changing space is we realized just making grants, traditional grants, wasn't enough to deal with the potential deal flow that was coming through our doors. So we've developed what we call the Knight Enterprise Fund, which is basically a venture fund that allows us to invest in startups when we see opportunities. So it's not out of my programming budget, but rather out of the corpus of the foundation, like a fund, a strategy for nurturing the funds we have, an investment strategy. We take equity stakes in early stage startups. So things like Upworthy, there's an organization in New York called Policy Mike, now called Mike. And second is the tools like prototypefund.org, which we've created to enable people, whether they're entrepreneurs or increasingly people inside of news organizations or other institutions, to step up with an idea and help them test them. Those are the two main tools we've got.
Yeah, could you come up to the microphone? Sorry, I have to make a move.
Fred, I just want to add one thing. I mean, the short answer, especially maybe from where you sit, is, well, the way that my organization can help your organization is to write you a check. And I think what we're all saying up here is it's not that simple anymore. You know, that is one way that we could support you. But I think that the problem is that the need is so great that we're thinking more in terms of things like, you know, maybe the better way to support you is to give you, if we're going to do a grant at all, is to do a grant that helps you actually get some support for creating a business plan that will keep you afloat without me. That is more how we're thinking. Because in fact, and we're seeing this happen, and I'm not suggesting that this is all well and good, but you know, not everybody is going to survive the shakeout. And the question that all organizations have to figure out is whether they have a chance of surviving the shakeout without being completely supported by something that's not the market. I mean, that's a really bare bones way to look at it, but sometimes the best help I can give you is to help you figure that out, and not necessarily to just write you a check.
Yeah, I guess I would just add to that, that there are networks out there that may be supportive in some of the skill sets that you need to grow or stay afloat, or experiment with storytelling, engage with audience, experiment with revenue building initiatives. I mean, I think, for example, of the INN, the Investigative News Network, and some of the work that they do with their membership around trying to do all of the above. Jen Schaefer isn't doing it today, but up until about a year ago at American University, she was working with a lot of digital startups created by women to help provide them with the skill sets, the initial funding that they needed to get off the ground, etc. API, the American Press Institute, right now is doing an initiative where they're trying to pair up news organizations with university-based researchers who can help them tackle audience issues that they're facing, to really explore how they can be more effectively engaged with their audience, which connects to credibility and faithfulness, and ultimately, hopefully, a source of revenue. And so they're doing meetings around the country and trying to pair up news organizations with J schools, with the goal of helping the news organizations learn more about their audience, etc. So I think part of the answer gets back to Barbara's. There are networks of work happening that it's good to be informed about. That could be helpful.
Time for one last question.
I think.
Let me get you closer to the mic.
With respect to that, I think it all makes sense what you're saying about timing and why you're approaching things the way you do. I just was curious if, based on your past experience, you have any concerns about funding fewer area reporting projects. I was just
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Oh, just as you're funding fewer specific reporting projects, I was just wondering if there are things you miss about working in those areas or opportunities that maybe you missed.
Are you concerned about, not the shift, I guess, that's been taking place? And if you're not reporting certain things, do you think that certain areas are being missed?
Is that an open question, or was that toward?
Yeah, open.
So I want to mention one reporting project that we are supporting at McCormick, which I'm really excited about. And it comes out of a conversation a year ago where we met with a reporter, a woman from Tennessee, who said that she kept reporting on obesity in her city, and people would talk about it for a day or two, and then it would be forgotten. And her comment was at a USC forum, how do you create sustained outrage? And so what we then had conversations with the Medill School at Northwestern, and they came up with an idea for a social justice reporting project. And it's basically to say in a city like Chicago, where we're located, what about bringing together reporters of all stripes from different media to report on a given topic? Of course, everyone taking their own angle and their own story, etc., but doing it as a news nexus with 12, 14, 16, I forget, community reporters. So they're from public radio to the Chicago Reporter to smaller community, Univision, Hoy, etc. So there's a couple Spanish language outlets in there. And so so the question is, what is the role of a J school in a local news environment, and how can it help to nurture strong reporting, a stronger web presence, but also the issue of the story and how to raise these stories collectively so that it's not just one person doing great work, but what about 20 stories, different angles on basically the same topic appearing in a concerted way. And so we're really excited about this. It's a new experiment, but the first round of stories are now appearing. They're all around the impact of the war on drugs on Chicago communities. And the variety of stories is fantastic. But what's really appealing about it is this partnership, and that they're all being rolled out over about a 2-month period together. The next round is about to start up, and they're taking applications, and it's going to be around issues connected to mental health. And we've seen all these closings of mental health clinics in the city, and what are the repercussions in terms of homelessness, in terms of street crime, etc. And so it's sort of taking this issue, which I think touches on your question of what about the stories, but we're trying to say, well, what about doing storytelling in a different, collective way that we've never maybe done before? So anyway.
Yeah, I mean, look, even if what we were all doing was 100% funding stories, you're still going to miss a lot of stories. You can't fund everything. So I think the notion is that with limited dollars, and I know 10 million or whatever we each have, it doesn't sound limited, but it is limited. How do we create something like what Mark is describing, which is building the scaffolding, building the structure of the people and the places that then can go out and do the stories. I think we feel like, we know you want to do the stories. Let us help you create the structure to do that in a way that makes the dollars the most efficient. I mean, we fund something called the Detroit Journalism Cooperative, which is a cluster of 7 ethnic and minority news organizations in Detroit to report on aspects of the bankruptcy and post-bankruptcy filing that are not being covered by the mainstream in Detroit. So they didn't come to us to tell us what their story list is. They came to tell us how they would work together to share stuff so that every dollar we spend to help them create this cooperative is being multiplied times 7 for their audience. So I think it's just a question of which way you go about making the stories happen. I don't think any of us are saying we don't care about the stories. We're saying what's the way with limited resources to get those stories told, and not just for the life of the grant.
Yeah, amen. And at the risk of ending on a morbid note, I'll use my morbid tone of voice. Clay Shirky posted a piece last night on Medium where he basically points out things that we've been seeing, which is that the short-term health of the industry is not good, to put it lightly, and the likelihood of further cutbacks is high, and it does mean we're going to miss more and more stories. The silver lining that he highlights is sort of 3 areas where we can exercise our muscles as news producers and sort of lean into the future a little bit. One around social, getting better at social both personally and with the brands we work with. Second, the future, and as we look at new teams and new startups develop, teamwork is a key aspect of it, and much more than burrowing down in a cubicle by oneself, rather, the muscles that you need to work in a team environment. And third, to go back to the numbers I started with, data. Right, being able to analyze, understand, and present data in ways that are appealing and enjoyable for audiences to use. But if you haven't seen that piece by Clay, and you're feeling good tonight after drinking the free alcohol from Eli Lilly, if you need a further downer, I suggest that piece.
Well, I don't think it was morbid at all, but pretty realistic. And I want to thank our panelists. Have you join me in thanking them? And our panelists.